What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today I want to jump right into it. I want to talk about the Canon 1DX Mark III and why I jumped on this Mark III. I know there's so many other cameras coming out, amazing cameras. I actually picked this up about 2 to 3 months ago, so I've had some time with it. I did wait a bit before I picked this up because I wanted to see what these other new cameras had to offer. The ups, the downs, there's no perfect camera. But at the end of it all, I felt like the Mark III was still gonna be the best camera for me. Now, I was looking for a camera that can do both video and photos excellent. I don't want to compromise in video nor in photos since we do shoot a lot of video and photos. Now, before the 1DX Mark III, I have been using the Canon C200, which is amazing. Like, it's just perfect in video. And I also been using the Canon EOS R, which the EOS R is an amazing camera, and still 2021, or I guess it's 2021 now, when it comes down to photos is excellent. I have nothing wrong to say about it. Autofocus is amazing, colors are amazing, just the way the photos come out of that camera look amazing. In video, there just was a small lag that I felt like I wasn't able to get on the EOS R. That's why when I was looking for a camera that can do both video and photos excellent, I saw the 1DX Mark III and I fell in love with it. Now, I'm gonna go over a few things that has stood out to me from the 1DX Mark III, and I'll start off with the resolution. This camera shoots in 5.5K RAW, which is really nice. My C200 shoots in 4K RAW, so I'm able to match these two cameras very close because they both shoot in RAW, and I'm able to manipulate the footage and match it together very good. This camera does shoot in RAW up to, I believe it shoots in 60 frames per second in 5.5K RAW, but the downside is that when I'm shooting in 60 frames per second, there's no autofocus. Like, there's just no autofocus at all. And also another downside is that when I'm shooting in RAW on this camera, whether it's 24 frames per second or 60 frames per second, there is no image stabilization or the digital image stabilization. So that is probably one of my biggest things that I don't like about this, is the fact that I can't shoot autofocus in 60 frames per second and that the digital IS does not work when I'm shooting in RAW. That is the biggest thing that I'm like annoyed by this camera. Other than that, there is a few other things that I wish it had, but the biggest one is the fact that I do not have autofocus in 60 frames per second. Now, something else I am gonna mention, which is a good thing and is also a bad thing, is the CF Express cards. They're very expensive. This is a 512 gigabyte card, and a 512 gigabyte card, you're gonna get up to, I believe it's 24 minutes in 60 frames per second in RAW. And I do believe you get about 35 minutes in 24 frames per second when you're shooting in RAW. So, I mean, you could shoot a lot of footage, but if you're trying to do a wedding, obviously, I probably wouldn't shoot a wedding in RAW. So I do highly recommend, if you guys do pick up the 1DX Mark III, to take full advantage of RAW. I would pick up the 512 gigabyte card. So that's only when you're shooting in RAW, but if you're not even shooting in RAW, if you just wanna shoot in 4K, regular 4K, you get up to 2 hours, which is more than enough time of recording, just 4K frames per second. So that's why I say I highly recommend you guys pick one of these cards up, keep that in your camera. It's gonna last you a very long time, super fast card. So, I mean, that's kind of like the beauty of these cards. So again, one of the things that just made me lean over to this camera is if I'm gonna shoot in RAW, I don't want to have no record limit or no compromise where it's like my camera's gonna overheat. I wanna be able to just record video, hit record, and just focus on creating and not worry about, I gotta turn off the camera, I gotta let it cool off, I gotta give it a few minutes to rest. I don't wanna be thinking about that stuff, and that's what scared me about other cameras that I saw that were coming out. So I've never had an issue with this camera overheating. I've never had no warning pop out. There's been no problem whatsoever. I do record a lot of long format video. I do video for my church, and when I'm doing video for my church, we are recording for over 30 minutes. We're probably going over for about 45 to 50 minutes nonstop. Another thing I am gonna mention that I don't like about this camera, but it's not a big issue for me, is the 30-minute record limit. After 30 minutes, it does stop recording, but you can just go ahead and hit the record button right when it stops, and it just continues recording for another 30 minutes. So what I do, I just set a timer on my phone for like 29 minutes. And after I notice that's about to stop, I just go ahead and hit the record button again. It's probably like a few millisecond gap of black space, which is not a big issue for me. And another thing to mention is when you're shooting in RAW or in 4K, if you're shooting in 60 frames per second, you're not gonna get no autofocus. That is my biggest disappointment from this camera. There is no autofocus in 60 frames per second unless you're shooting in 1080p. If you're shooting in 1080p, you do get full frame autofocus on this camera. Now, there is autofocus in 4K 60 frames per second, but you would be shooting in a crop mode. So as soon as you put your camera in crop mode, you will get autofocus, but you're cropping your image. If that's a big issue, then I would not recommend this camera. If you guys are like, man, you want full frame autofocus in 4K 60. For me, it wasn't a huge issue. I mean, it is a big issue, but it didn't stop me from buying it because I come from the GH5 and I was shooting with the GH5 for many years. So I was used to manual focus for a very long time. So I was okay with that. And still, when I'm gonna be shooting in 4K 60 or in RAW at 60 frames per second, I will use manual focus, or I would just go ahead and crop it, and I would just go ahead and just deal with that. Now, something I want to kind of go back to, since I did touch up on it, is the 1080p on this camera. I've actually been finding myself shooting in 1080p a lot on the 1DX Mark III. The 1080p on this camera looks so much better than any other 1080p that I've ever experienced. Now, on the Canon C200, when I'm shooting in 1080p, if I'm shooting a 120 frames per second 1080p, it looks horrible. The Canon EOS R 1080p actually looks decent. It doesn't look bad at all. But the 1080p from the 1DX Mark III looks amazing. So another thing is the frame rates on this camera, the frame rates that it shoots in. It shoots in obviously 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and 120 frames per second. Another thing that I wish it did have that it doesn't is the fact that it only shoots in 60 frames per second in 4K and also in RAW. I wish it did shoot in 120 frames per second in 4K. It does not give you that option. But again, when it comes down to slow motion, it's not a deal breaker for me. Something I do wish it had, but I'm not shooting 120 all the time, and that's not a necessity for me. Now, the autofocus on this camera is just amazing. It's just crazy how good it is in photo and in video. It has amazing autofocus. It has an eye tracking autofocus, so it tracks my subject's eye really good. I've never had an issue with it. I've shot video for my church. I have the 1DX Mark III way in the back, and it does track the eye, which I'm very surprised. Another thing, guys, this camera to me, I feel like it's just very reliable, and that's how it feels when I'm out shooting, especially when I'm doing videos for my church. I just feel like I can set it up, set my exposure and all that, hit record, and it does its thing. It does it what I want it to do, and so far I've not had one issue with it when it comes down to autofocus, overheating. It's just very amazing at what it does. Now, the digital image stabilization on this camera, something else I want to mention, is a good thing that it has it, but it's not the best thing. So it works good, but then it doesn't work good depending on how you're going to use it. I noticed that I use the digital IS most of the time if I'm going to be holding the camera, pointing the camera to my subject and just holding it still. It works amazing. I always have it on. But if I know I'm gonna be tracking my subject or I'm gonna be moving my camera from left to right, I just turn it off because it does some weird, it just messes up your shot. You come back to your computer, you import it, you look at it and it's like, what the heck is going on? I didn't do that. So it just kind of does not work for those situations, but I'm so happy it does have it because I do use it a lot. So now the low light on this camera, is amazing. I just shot a wedding not too long ago and we shot, it was all at nighttime. They didn't have great lighting, and I noticed that I pushed this camera up all the way up to 10,000 ISO, and I felt like the image was more than usable. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I could have probably pushed it a little bit more and still been able to use the image. Now, I do notice that at nighttime or when it's not the best lighting, I don't shoot in log. I'll just go ahead and shoot in a flat profile, like in a neutral profile, and I push my ISO up to like 10,000 and the image looks amazing. Another thing is the file sizes. Files coming out of this camera, putting it into my Mac. And I do edit in Final Cut. That's the program that I use to edit most of my videos. The files on this camera, they're small files. They're not gonna take up your cards. Like, you can fit a lot of recording time on these cards. The only thing that that's kind of hard is just editing these 4K files. They're nearly impossible to edit on my computer. And so I create proxy files, and as soon as I'm done, I'm able to edit and there's no issues at all. But just know that you're gonna have to spend some time creating proxy files, which does take some time. So the last thing I do want to mention is the LCD monitor in the back of this camera. As you guys can see, it has actually a pretty big LCD screen in the back. As soon as I remember when I first got it, I was like, man, this thing, the image looks so big. One thing that I noticed on the 1DX Mark III, which is, it kind of sucks that it's like this, but again, you just have to get used to it. You don't have no zebras, you don't have no waveforms, so you're not really able to monitor your exposure when you're shooting in RAW or in log. You just kind of have to guess that your image is gonna come out good. Another thing I noticed is that your image, when you're exposing for it, it looks like it's good, but then when you put it into your editing software, it might be underexposed. So I noticed that I don't know, the image that you get right here is not accurate. So I now I know how to expose using this monitor, and I have to overexpose my shot, and it looks blown out on the LCD screen right here, but it's really not blown out. You still have all your information. So that's something that it took me some time to really nail my exposure using this LCD screen. That's something that, it is what it is, something you have to work around with and just get used to your camera. But that's pretty much it, guys. I mean, there's so much more in this camera. I just kind of wanted to touch up on a few points and let you guys know some things that I like about this, that I probably don't like about this. But overall, this camera has been amazing. It has checked off all the marks for me, and the things that I don't like about it, they're not a big deal breaker for me that I wouldn't want to keep using it. So I know I'm gonna stick with this for a very long time, just like the C200, and continue my journey using the 1DX Mark III. So that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I highly appreciate each and every one of you guys that has tuned in to check out my videos. God bless you guys. I'll catch you guys on our next video.